So can you hear me? Can I reach you out with my words? Because as John Tagged has warned me, I will not be able to see the audience. I will sense its presence. So, so it's just a kind of environmental effect. Well, anyway, I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity. And as everyone else before me, I am very much impressed by the generosity and by the warm welcome accorded here in Warsaw. Thank you. So the paper that I'm going to deliver today is speculative, and I will refer to a concrete photographic series, but I do not want you to look at the pictures that will be there on the wall right behind me, to look at them as works of art. I mean, well, that's what happens to photography when it's shown in big museums and when it becomes part of the archive often enough, but rather treat these images as a TV program, as something that does not really call for your specific attention. And that brings to mind the Benjaminian dictum of distracted attention. So if you find enough force for distracted attention, that would be fine. So without much ado, let me turn to my paper. So the experience of recent history, which united East and West in a tight, however forced embrace, and the traces it has left behind, prompt us, survivors of that time who still happen to remember, to reconsider the traditional conception of the archive. There are so many images of the period in question that have become iconic. Yet, there is a much greater array of those that remain blurred, fragmented, incomplete, in a word, wholly insignificant. Will they ever be elevated to the status of an archival document? Do they deserve becoming part of an archive at all? It is these issues that I will be addressing by turning to a photographic series which, on the one hand, is well embedded in historical time, while on the other implicitly calls for a reinterpretation of historicity itself. Krzysztof, you can, show the pictures slowly. Yeah, okay, thank you. Before turning to Yesterday's Sandwich, a series by the famous photographer Boris Mikhailov, let me briefly explain in what way artistic production may be more telling and truer to life than visual evidence that is generically seen as documentary. Indeed, in terms of genre, Mikhailov is far from being a documentary photographer. The scenes he depicts are often overtly enacted. His models pose for him on a contractual basis, and he is a formalist in the sense that he recurs to a whole set of devices, such as use of color or the superimposition of shots. Yet I am deeply convinced that his rendering of the Soviet and post-Soviet experience is one of the greatest documents of this historical period. What I have in mind is not the well-known premise that intuitively or subconsciously artists tend to grasp the spirit of their time, and that by properly reading their texts, that is, deciphering them on the semantic and symbolic levels, we will be able to uncover some higher impersonal truth. I have already twice used the word experience in this paper, and I think it is a key to understanding Mikhailov's project as a whole. He is a documentary photographer precisely inasmuch as he succeeds in giving expression to what remains essentially unrepresentable. Here we are confronted with a real paradox. Aren't we always looking for the tangible traces of the past? And isn't the archive To be more exact, the various existing archives packed with such irrefutable evidence. My contention is that photographers such as Boris Mikhailov first draw heavily on the invisible, namely a shared historical experience that forms both the condition and the ultimate horizon of their work, and second, in doing so, they challenge the state of the archive, which has everything to do with historical memory and ways in which it is preserved and passed on to future generations. Yesterday's Sandwich is a series of photographic impositions dating from as early as the 60s. The artist insists that a purposeful search for the arbitrary, which is at the heart of his method, is to some extent an anticipation of Sartre's art. Well, now, Sartre's art, as you may know, is a reaction to the official school of socialist realism. It's a critical inversion of socialist realism. Indeed, there is a lot of irony in Mikhailov's works, and quite often it addresses the social environment. Mikhailov's conceptual approach to art may be also discerned in his specific use of color. He clearly privileges red, ranging from a sign of statehood to color per se, when the relationship it enters with its double-layered ground becomes entirely formal. However, even if the traces of Sartre's art are practically indisputable, and the task of art historians is to read these works in terms of origins, now that several decades elapsed since that time, viewers who are out of touch with recent Soviet history find it hard to understand how and why artists combined elements of the ideological language to express their critical position. To put it another way, Sartre's art as a movement and project calls for systematic reconstruction. However, besides this historical documentary content, Yesterday's Sandwich, in my view, has another potential, which again is related to the document, but only insofar as it is freed of usual archival implications. The artist Ilya Kabakov once defined Mikhailov's photographs as total. This should not be understood in the sense that they aspire to completeness or that each of them lays claim to an artistic status for itself. Boris Mikhailov has always worked with a raw material of life whose artistic value is by definition low or worthless altogether. It is not that the life he depicted was unspectacular, that is, eventless, gray, and dreary. Mikhailov has always uncovered a different dimension in life, one that we are still able to relate to today, despite the dramatic change of historical context. Therefore, describing Mikhailov's pictures as total, Kabakov was referring to a penetrating direct hit, to that by means of which they function, to quote him once again, like shrapnel. At the same time, no separate element is highlighted in the pictures, whether detail, character, concrete image, or perspective. I would like to depart from the idea of a total photograph whose intersection with Kabakov's own total installation is quite obvious, in order to suggest that superimpositions, another name for Yesterday's Sandwich, might be regarded as memory images. At this point, it is appropriate to briefly recall the interpretation of memory images made by Henri Bergson, one of the most radical thinkers of the 20th century. It is well known that together with Freud and Proust, Bergson lays the ground for the understanding of involuntary memory, although the term itself belongs to Proust. In Bergson, we come across two distinct forms of memory. The one boils down to motor mechanisms which enable us to adapt to the present situation. It is dependent on our will and acts our past experience without, however, calling up its image. In fact, it is not so much memory, properly speaking, as habit. Determined by nature, it reflects the biological need of our body to correspond to its environment. The other is the true memory, coextensive with consciousness and, unlike the first, moving wholly in the past. It consists of memory images that picture all past events with their outline, their color, and their place in time. This memory, says Bergson, is entirely spontaneous, being as capricious in reproducing as it is faithful in preserving. It serves neither utility nor practical application, but in storing up images follows a necessity dictated by a nature of its own. If the first form of memory is based on repetition, the second is oriented towards imagination. Whatever has been translated into a memory image remains essentially unrepeatable, that is, unique. The two forms of memory, according to Bergson, are connected through the human body, which, itself an image, is a section of the universal becoming. In other words, the place of passage of the movements that are both received and thrown back and are known to us as sensori-motor phenomena. Thus, memory expressed in images, the one that is also defined, in fact, by Bergson himself as virtual or pure, can only be actualized, that is, materialized, in the present moment of perception. Before returning to yesterday's sandwich, let me enumerate the qualities of the memory image according to Bergson. Memory images are fugitive. No wonder Bergson compares them to dream images that appear and disappear independently of our will. Spontaneous by their very nature, memory images, says he, flash out at intervals, only to be inhibited and ousted by the slightest movement of the voluntary memory. Now, if we recollect the dream image in Freud, it emerges in a state of psychic passivity, or literally in an absent state of mind, and is nothing other than a diagram or outline of the figures that appear in dreams themselves. In other words, dream images rise to the surface of consciousness when the latter is emptied and flattened out. That is when the subject loses all control of its mental operations and representations. Bergson further observes that despite their evanescence, memory images are complete, which is perhaps best proven by the faculty of mental photography, that is, to all appearances subconscious. The memory image is perfect from the outset. If darkened, in other words, repressed, as we would say today, the image tends to re-emerge if only in a state of sleep. Finally, Bergson does not overlook the fact that memory images are affective. Their affective coloring, as he puts it, only adds to the immediate completeness of the image. I will now try to relate these thoughts to photography. As I have said, Mikhailov's pictures function like memory images. But what kind of memory do they refer to, and what exactly do they bring into view? The memory in question has an unusual mode of existence. It is not based on the certitude of facts, although it may well integrate them. This memory is essentially affective. It is inseparable from the emotional tone of those upon whom it descends. This is not a mere figure of speech, since the memory I am discussing belongs to no one in particular. Rather, it is an image that comes from without, and yet is perfectly recognizable. Recognized images are total. They contain no gaps or ruptures. They seize us in the manner that was once so well described by Proust. I think it has become already clear that memory images are a priori collective, and perhaps Walter Benjamin was the first to point to the connection between involuntary memory, experience, and the material of a collective past. Involuntary memory is the language of experience itself. Benjamin distinguishes Erfahrung from Erlebnis, that is, experience in the proper sense, from an incident turned into a moment that has been lived. Experience breaks the shield of consciousness, and without having entered the realm of awareness, that is, without having been tied to a certain hour in one's life, is stored in the form of unconscious memory traces. For Freud, it would be equal to trauma, which necessarily comes back and is hopefully acted out by way of symptoms and/or distorted images. On the other hand, what is experienced explicitly or consciously tends to be forgotten in the long run. Such, in fact, is the ethos of the archive. But experience, as I have said, remains essentially unrepresentable. It can be retrieved only tangentially, to the extent to which a visible image triggers recognition. And as spectators, we may be able to recognize what we have never seen or known. There is nothing mystical about it. Our experience of history, by and large, is mediated by images and simulacra, while history itself remains forever out of reach. Mikhailov's photographs awaken and legitimate our own historical fantasies. Only it should be understood that the imaginary is itself a shared experience of the historical. For various reasons, we, a fantasizing or imagining collective, are denied access even to the most recent historical events. Moreover, there are histories that are not reduced to narratives or mere chronological sequences of dates and events. In this case, we are dealing with the experience of history as it is lived through by such unstable entities as generations. Therefore, we recognize the past not as a form of positive knowledge, but rather as something that persists in its formless existence, haunting our memory precisely because it is omitted from it. This brings us back to yesterday's sandwich and to the present time of perception. In many of the photographs, it is the texture that seems to come to the foreground. Coarseness of the walls, dry, cracked soil, maybe crumpled paper, a naked body sliced into rhombi by a hammock, clumsy, semi-childish scribble, or simply graininess, occasionally thickening into a cloud. Memories are as tactile as they are visual, and so their truth may be uncovered at this level of the signifier. Thus, superimpositions show as much as they conceal. They uncover the workings of memory, but they do not try to represent them. One can hardly learn something from these pictures. As documents, they are subjective and therefore unreliable. Yet, they tell us a lot, precisely by displaying no pretension whatsoever. Every person has her own experience of the arbitrary, and it is out of arbitrary images, echoes of real events and sensations, that an ego is eventually constructed. Here, however, the images pertain to a historically transient collective. Unlike Saute's art, an ironic juxtaposition of the official and what might be called private buffoonery, memory images retain both of these dimensions at once. In them, the ideological is dissolved in the everyday, in which there are always zones of freedom. Irony in this case is not a consciously chosen device, but the effect of existence itself that incessantly resists visual and discursive appropriation. I think it is significant, but also very much predictable, that yesterday's sandwich attracts viewers today, when the rejection of the Soviet past gives way to its estranged and tranquil contemplation. I would like to stress that memory images are in no way retrospective. Their time is not fulfilled, and they cannot be wholly relegated to the past. These invisible images are specters haunting the present, points of rupture within the present itself. Memories are precisely cracks in the present. They disrupt the continuity of time, including that of history. Far from being a fact of the past, Mikhailov's sandwich, in my view, is more of a commentary to the present. The photos in the series often border on absurdity. However, it is not an objective mark of the time as Soth's art would have it, but a feature of the memory in question. Memory images are useless, no doubt, but in addition, they are utterly senseless. Numerous haphazard details are woven into a spectral fabric that gnaws at the present itself. It would be no exaggeration to say that all of Mikhailov's photos are about time and a collective existence in time. As I have shown elsewhere, what they managed to display without making a representation of it is the affect of Soviet time itself. What is at issue is a shared historical experience. However, it is not translated into signs of the Soviet. That is all those ethnographic or cultural details that abound in Mikhailov's pictures and, I hasten to add, are so valued by the archive. To put it differently, experience is at odds with semiotics as well as language in a broader sense. But what is the place of experience and or affect in visual representation? We are so trustful of visual data that it becomes difficult to conceptualize the very condition under which images penetrate into the realm of visibility. In the concluding section of my paper, I will treat this issue by turning to Walter Benjamin and his concept of the dialectical image. Benjamin conceives of the dialectical image in terms of a constellation of the past and the present. However, quote, it isn't that the past casts its light on what is present, or that what is present casts its light on what is past. Rather, an image is that in which the then and the now come together in a flash of lightning into a constellation. End of quote. Benjamin's constellation has a temporality which is distinct from the homogeneous empty time of history. It is what he calls Jetztzeit, or the now, also translated as now time. It should hardly come as a surprise that this time is associated with a messianic, namely a messianic cessation of happening, but likewise a caesura in the movement of thought. We are therefore dealing with a double interruption or arrest, the dropping out of historical time and the suspension of thinking itself. This new temporality, closely linked to Benjamin's method, namely dialectics at a standstill, accounts for ways in which a historical object is constructed. Indeed, the latter should be blasted out of the continuum of history. Being essentially a monad, says Benjamin, it retains on a reduced scale all the forces and interests that are at play in history. But the historical object is precisely the dialectical image, the positioning of which, Benjamin insists, is in no way arbitrary. It turns out that images lend themselves to a meaningful interpretation only at specific moments. For Benjamin, those are moments of danger or crisis. As perhaps it was the case with his own thesis on the philosophy of history, written in 1940, that can be read as an attempt at affirming the possibility of revolutionary change in a time of utter hopelessness. And it is the task of the historical materialist, in a broader sense of a critical observer, to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up in a moment of danger. But this is also a critical point in the movement of images themselves, or, in Benjamin's words, their coming to legibility. The past is to be held fast, then, in the now of recognition. How can we make use of this rather complicated scheme for our own purposes? First of all, I would like to point to a certain kinship between photography as I see it and the dialectical image. The cognitive aspect of the dialectical image seems to be quite obvious. It is a method allowing for a reading of historical events, especially those that have been passed on in silence. The task of the historical materialist, argues Benjamin, is to brush history against the grain. At the same time, a dialectical image is always necessarily material. It rises out of an object, work of art, text, document, or memory. The same holds true for the photograph. On the one hand, it is a visual representation distinct from other kinds of representation, such as cinema or painting, for example. But on the other, it is itself a temporal structure, or, in the words of Barthes, a new space-time category, since the presence it captures, although absolute, is always already deferred. To put it differently, there is something in the photograph and about it that does not belong to the order of representation, a caesura of sorts. However, it is not only discontinuity between representation and the represented that the photograph's temporality implies. It is also that which has to be read into the photograph, into the photographic image, so that it would become truly meaningful or documentary. Alluding to an unspoken government presence and fabricated ideals in the pictures made in the USSR and the US during the 1930s, Philip Brookman, I think he was one of the curators of the show in question, has shrewdly remarked, "Today, we must reference the inauthentic nature of the documentary image in order to seek its authenticity." This is absolutely true. I would slightly reformulate his thought by saying, today we must reference, period. In other words, our perception of the documentary image is accurate to the extent to which we embrace the historical conditions that allow for its initial legibility. Such conditions, however, are not some unattainable abstraction, but rather those structures of feeling, in the words of Raymond Williams, that had made the pictures recognizable, first of all, by their contemporaries. Today, this invisible dimension is activated by our own perception, which is itself is inauthentic, to be sure. However, must, as applied to reference, means that the time, if not exactly critical, is ripe for the flash of recognition on our part. By way of conclusion, I would like to return to the questions that were posed at the beginning of this paper. I think that photos such as Mikhailov's Yesterday's Sandwich challenge our understanding of the archive. They depict historical events whose symbolic status remains open, to say the very least. These events have to do with the shared emotional experience and or the dream images that express unconscious collective aspirations and desires. It is an almost impossible task to find a place for them in the visible image, since they remain suspended between language and history themselves. Yet, if my assumption is correct, then Mikhailov's photographs teach us the following lesson. History decomposes into images, not into narratives. Such was Walter Benjamin's materialist approach to history. That's Benjamin's phrase. And it is at this point, I will add, that photography converges with the dialectical image. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen Petrovsky. After this, in the morning session, we have learned about information theory and discourse analysis of the archival photographic regime. You introduced a Bergsonian among a Benjaminesque reading. Of course, now I understand the title of your paper, Better Matter and Memory of Photography, of course, was a clear allusion. And concentrating on Mikhailov's photographies. You gave both the Bergsonian and the Benjaminian reading in the best sense of what Derrida in his book Archival Fever has described as there are not just positive archives, but there are archives of virtuality. And in a way, I think between the lines you implied this reading as well. Now, I would be tempted to ask, how do you really combine the Bergsonian reading with the positive dialectical materialist Marxist reading of Benjamin, claiming there is a necessity of the past which shines through, which is, I think, exactly what Derrida tried to deconstruct, or which Bergson would contradict. But unless I reserve this question because I think it's not that easy. Please, we are more curious to get questions from the audience.
Should I respond?
Okay. Yeah,
yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. Well, first of all, I don't think that what we find in Benjamin is what you called a positive version of Marxism. His Marxism is very weird, you know? And what Derrida likes about Benjamin a lot is this sense of the messianic. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, I mean, the word messianic may sound misleading in many ways, well, because it is overdetermined in a way. I mean, it's so heavily connoted that it's hard to use it. For example, Nancy, when he speaks of what he calls the encounter with the other, he says, I never refer to the term messianic or messiah or whatever. But Derrida does, and Benjamin did, to be sure. And what was, I think, the point of intersection is that it is about a different form of temporality. So, well, as I have tried to show in the paper, well, you know that Benjamin was very much against the empty, the vision of history as progress. That is what he called empty, homogeneous time, and so on. And he found chips of the messianic in the present. It's the now time. It's the Jetztzeit, as he calls it. So for him, the moment is ripe already. At his time of life, it was ready for a certain kind of interpretation of what he himself termed as the dialectical image. Well, because it was indeed a critical moment for Marxism, but also it was the rise of fascism in Europe, so he witnessed both. And it is at that historical juncture that he wrote his thesis on the philosophy of history. So it's about time, also about revolution, about revolutionary change. And, says Derrida, and that's quite amazing, he says, if we do not admit the coming of the absolute other, as he puts it in his own language, we will not be able to account for revolutionary change, for revolution. Revolution is the absolute other, is the coming of the absolute other. So, again, it's about historical events. The possibility of eventuality, if you will. So I think it's, if we speak of Marxism, we have to really be very, very careful and accurate in defining the kind of Marxism that Benjamin was developing, which was problematic even with Adorno to a certain extent.
Yeah, thank you. I already admire the translators for it's such a
Oh, excuse me.
What a task to translate this high complex level of argumentation, but it's brilliant, of course. Well, you.
I would like to ask you a question about something you were telling at the end, because you told that history decomposes into images, not narratives. Mm-hmm. But I was thinking about this statement in context of Mikhailov's work, because actually he creates images that's obvious. But from the other hand, he's telling stories about a past of USSR. So how to understand this sentence in a context of artistic works? Could you say something more?
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you very much for the question. That's an important question because it actually calls for the introduction of new distinctions, you know, because if I had more time, if we all had more time, we could probably go into a fascinating distinction between image as something invisible that I was, you know, hinting at, and representation, because what artists always you know, present to us are endless images in the sense of endless representations. Whereas I was referring to this, well, if you will, invisible component of a picture, of a photograph, of something that allows for its penetrating into the realm of visibility, of its developing itself. That, you know, you chemically develop a photograph, but also it's a historical form of development. I mean, there is a time at which a photograph is recognized by its contemporaries, but also by the people that, you know, never knew anything about that time. So I think it's this moment that I have in mind. Now, as for Mikhailov, he tells stories. Well, he does tell stories sometimes with his pictures. Well, for example, he has an album called Look at Me, I Look at Water. And I would say that there's something cinematic about the composition of the pictures in that album, because he assembles like 2, 3, 4 shots together, and that's a proto-narrative, But of course, it's, you see, what can you learn from his pictures about the time? I can't show you Salt Lake. He has a fantastic series called Salt Lake. Now, the plot or the reason for his assembling all these pictures on the factual level, on the factographic level, is that people thought that waste from a certain factory was good for their health. They didn't know it was actual waste. They thought those were salt lakes, so they would go to the salt lakes and they would bathe in the water and, you know, then in the sun and so on. So, I mean, it's kind of grotesque in many ways. But he would take pictures of those people wearing, you know, not bathing suits, but just ordinary Soviet underwear and, well, just spending their time in the open, unpretentiously. They're not beautiful people. There's nothing to show. There's nothing to learn from those pictures. But precisely because this aesthetic component is so hugely reduced to the level, let's say, of an amateur photograph. Well, I mean, he does it on purpose, definitely. That's also a form of aesthetics, or that's for sure. And we have learned much about that from conceptual artists, and Mikhailov is a conceptual artist. But also, he manages to convey a certain sense of the useless, of something that you can never, of the redundant, something you can never put to use, something that is not translated into categories of positive knowledge. Nothing to learn, nothing to hold, nothing to show to the future generations. Just this vague sense of life, of a life that goes on, that persists. And that's it. And, I mean, there's much I'm finishing, I'm wrapping up. There's much to say about this person. He's a very interesting artist, and his show is on at the MoMA. It will open on the 25th of May, so those of you who have this chance, please take a look for yourselves. Thank you.
I thought it was really curious that at the very end of your presentation you used the term unconscious, which hadn't come up before, and throughout your talk, even before that point, I had thought that if we managed to rid ourselves of everything we knew about Mikhailov, the fact that he deals with Soviet reality, the fact that he's generally referred to as a conceptualist, and so on, listening to you, we could actually have the impression that he was a surrealist, somebody who deals with the invisible, somebody who finds images for what is not narrative, and so on. And of course, if anybody looked at these images and had not heard of Mikhailov before, that might indeed be an interesting reference point. And, you know, let's not forget that Surrealism was a documentary project. It was an archival project. So, but then I was curious how, if you sort of think about Mikhailov in these terms, then Kabakov's idea of his images as total seems to be in opposition to that, right? Because a total image captures everything. And it's curious, though, at the same time, that in Kabakov, whose work, at least in the 1990s, was very archival, there's also always a point at which the archive collapses, right? And there's always a point at which all that's left of the archive is a bunch of garbage, or a point at which nothing appears to make sense anymore. So the totality is always compromised, right? It's never completely total. In any of his installations, you have a sense that that totality is always organized around a core that is not visualizable. So I'm just rambling. I was just curious if that could be a sort of a meeting point between the sort of, I don't know, pseudo-surrealism of Mikhailov and his work as a Soviet or post-Soviet artist.
Well, thank you for noticing those very subtle things. Well, you know, as for total, I mean, well, this is a word that comes from Kabakov, to be sure. But, you know, when he speaks of Mikhailov, I tried to emphasize that when he speaks of Mikhailov, he doesn't really mean, you know, like embracing everything in one image, that is giving a full account of what actually happened in one image, but he means that he has a rare capacity, well, as he puts it, of hitting, you know, directly, of doing something very much to the point. So the total is not so much about representation as it is about truth. You know, I would use quotation marks or whatever, truth, because you can be truthful by being untruthful, let's say, to details or whatever. We know that through Cindy Sherman, for example. Well, unfortunately, I can't go into that, but what the series, what is her series about? I mean, the untitled film stills of the 50s. I mean, no such films have ever existed, but she sparked off total recognition. Everybody said, oh yes, we know what it's all about. We saw those movies. Oh, we don't remember the details, but so she triggered off a sense of shared fantasies that are prior to any individual act of perception. That is to say that she worked or acted as a developer. Like in developer, I mean a developing mechanism in the sense that she brought this to the fore, and this is an extremely complicated issue, in fact. Okay, but then about the unconscious. You know, I am suspicious about the word unconscious myself, but it surfaces in Walter Benjamin when he speaks of dream images, because for him they're not as good as dialectical images. They wait for a moment of awakening. So I don't insist upon the word unconscious, but what I do like is the notion of structures of feeling that you find in Raymond Williams. And he was trying to conceptualize a certain period in history that cannot be accounted for by the big categories of the Marxian analysis of consciousness. Well, he's a Marxist. By the big categories of the Marxian analysis of consciousness. He says we have to come up with new categories. We have to speak of moments when ideology itself is in the making, when values are suspended, they're lived through. So for this very fleeting moment when values are lived through, when ideology is still not fully formed, he comes up with this term structures of feeling, which is, again, something not subjective. I mean, belonging, it's not mine or yours, but it's already indicative of a certain collective that has, you know, this same emotional ground or emotional tone, and we recognize this tone. And this is how we become individualized, through this tone.
Okay, since we are already behind time, thank you for a very rich talk, and this could develop into further discussion during our next breaks. Thank you very much.